Buongiorno a tutti.
Good morning, everyone. Also on behalf of the Speaker of the President of the Chamber of Deputies, Mr. Roberto Fico, and I would like to welcome to the Senate the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. António Guterres, whom we have the honor to have here with us this morning on this important opportunity. Please allow me to introduce a few introductory remarks. Mr. Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. President of the Chamber of Deputies, Senators, Deputies, Excellencies, students, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor for us to welcome you here in this Parliamentary Assembly that was chaired by a statesman, Amintore Fanfani, for a number of years, and he's the only Italian to have had the privilege to chair the United Nations General Assembly at a crucial time in UN history. This predecessor of mine is one of our constituent fathers, and it bears witness of the historical climate that led to the creation of the United Nations, the Italian Republic, and its parliament. The parliament of a country that regained freedom, and the Parliament of Man, as where the United Nations effectively defined all those years ago. On the rubble of the Second World War, over 70 years ago, the United Nations Charter stated the aim to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. 2 years later, the Italian Parliament, with that charter in mind and those commitments in mind and in remembrance of the tragic experience of the past, laid down in its constitution the principle whereby Italy rejects war as an instrument of aggression against the freedom of other peoples and as a means for the settlement of international disputes. This is a principle which is at the basis of Italian foreign policy, together with another principle whereby Italy agrees, on condition of equality with other states, to the limitations of sovereignty that may be necessary to a world order ensuring peace and justice among the nations, and promotes international organizations that have this aim in mind. And constituent fathers were thinking to the United Nations when they wrote that provision. So that's it. Say, for us, for Italy, it is a constitutional imperative to defend the principles and values of the UN Charter, to share the objectives and contribute to their achievement. That's why we support peacekeeping missions, UN agencies, UN funds and programs. Rome, our capital, Mr. Secretary General, is proud to host the headquarters of the FAO, of the World Food Programme, and IFAD. The United Nations are a forum for dialogue and conciliation, the venue where politics and justice can and should meet. It's a bridge between peoples. And the UN, today, in an ever-shrinking world, can and should claim its place, its role as a real and veritable universal authority. The United Nations is a success story. Let us think to the coding and development of international law, which is represented also by the creation here in Rome of the International Criminal Court. Let's also think of the construction of the rules on human rights and the solution of so many different conflicts around the world. Today, there are extraordinary issues that concern the life itself of our planet, and these challenges must find an adequate legal and political response at international level. With courage and wisdom, you, Mr. Secretary General, over the last few years, reminded everyone how urgent the measures to be undertaken are so as to avoid that the development of the world clashes against the limits of the planet. The disappointing outcome of the Madrid Conference on Climate Change must make us aware and must make us firmer towards the pursuit of objectives on which the survival of our civilization depends. I witness the extraordinary phenomenon that hits the city of Venice. We are running the risk to lose an artistic, cultural, and historical heritage which is invaluable. Over 2/3 of bigger cities, of larger cities in the world, are close to the sea. So we can understand, as you yourself said in Madrid, how grave is the threat of the rising sea levels. We need more than an incremental approach. We need radical change to our way of life and to the way we interpret the planet. This is the overall meaning. This is the deep meaning of Agenda 2030, a program of action to change the overall mode of development. Sustainability is not just a matter of relationship between man and the environment. It is the population change generates migration, and it can only be regulated at world level. And only in this way can we ensure the growth and can we assure the legitimate expectations of welfare of all people in a context where there are no tensions, no social instability, no conflicts. These tensions we are a witness of every day in the Mediterranean, and just across the sea, the Libyan situation bears witness of these tensions. That's a country, Mr. Secretary General, where the United Nations, through your special representative, play a crucial role, a precious role, to start a political process leading to a peaceful solution. This legislative chamber, where every day we try to build new rules for our country through an open dialogue, well, this meeting room, I believe, is the right place to host your address. The task of the United Nations is the promotion of the sovereignty of law. Recent history shows that full application of international norms and regulations is effective, but at the same time, too many events show the ineffectiveness of the solution born out of a lack of respect for those international regulations. So your presence here in the Senate, Mr. Secretary General, reminds us of the value of this moral imperative before being legal imperative. Thank you.
Invito ora.
I'll now give the floor to the President of the Chamber of Deputies.
Good morning, everyone. Mr. Secretary General of the United Nations, Madam President of the Senate, authorities, fellow colleagues of the Parliament, authorities, ladies and gentlemen. It is of paramount significance for the United Nations Secretary General to wish to share a solemn moment with the Italian Parliament in continuity with his respected predecessors. 4 years ago, the Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, addressed members of the Chamber of Deputies and Senate for the 64th anniversary of Italy's accession to the United Nations. At that time, the interim speakers of the Houses of Parliament rightly underscored Italy's steadfast commitment to safeguard and promote the principles and values enshrined in the United Nations Charter. I believe that it is neither ritual nor trivial to solemnly confirm that commitment yet again. I think it is appropriate to reiterate that we need to be effective more and more, considering the changes, the political changes that are occurring at global level. I think that it is appropriate, in fact, to reiterate today that despite the hardship situations in which it has operated, in the past 70 years, the UN has contributed to making our world a better, fairer, and more equitable place. Despite the many difficulties, and despite the sensitivities clearly there is still much to do, but the United Nations has undeniably played a crucial role in designing our future, and notably that of our new generations. I wish to point out that actually today marks the 12th anniversary of the first UN resolution on the global moratorium on the death penalty, which was approved by the General Assembly following a proposal presented by Italy. In its latest version, voted in 2018, the number of adopting states increased even further. And we can indeed feel proud of our country for having fostered an initiative expressing a civilized choice for the right to life. I also wish to point out that without the United Nations, we would not have the treaties banning and combating human rights infringements like the ones on torture and trafficking in human beings. We wouldn't have the conventions on the rights of the child and adolescents, whose 30th anniversary we celebrated recently. We wouldn't have the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, nor would we have peacekeeping missions in which our country has always actively participated in. Through its efforts, the climate conferences and the Tokyo and Paris agreements, the United Nations has engendered a generalized and needed commitment to combat climate change and avert catastrophic consequences for all of mankind. In this regard, I can't help but express my deepest concern for the highly disappointing outcome of the Madrid summit. It is my hope to see the missing solutions come from the next edition of the COP meeting to be co-organized by Italy and the United Kingdom. We need a serious, responsible, and far-sighted engagement of all countries. Europe, above all, by setting advanced environmental policies, must commit to being the green engine, the driving force for the rest of the world towards a sustainable energy transition and a solid circular economy. These are goals that, among other things, match the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This is a comprehensive strategy to overcome the current development model and build a new and fairer economic, social, and environmental system. This agenda has now become a common language, a set of guidelines not only for public policies but for private sector policies as well. I do believe everyone acknowledges the important work done to protect the more vulnerable people by UN agencies and specialized institutions of the UN, such as UNICEF or UNHCR. Just a year ago, the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration was approved to establish a governance framework for increasing flows of persons fleeing from conflict, persecution, and poverty in respect of their fundamental rights and without harboring any illusions that they can be stopped with walls or barbed wire. Finally, I'll mention the Rome-based agro-food and food security agencies, as well as the Brindisi logistics base that the Secretary General will be visiting tomorrow. Yet this fundamental role of the United Nations is being directly or indirectly questioned, over and above the legitimate request for a leaner and more effective organizational restructuring. Some countries, or leading political forces therein, are clearly trying to undermine the very goal for which the UN was established, i.e., a new multilateral international order aimed at maintaining peace and security, protecting and promoting human rights, and fostering dialogue among states. Instead, some countries seek an order which is merely based on the balance of power, economic and military, and on a clash, even head-on, between national powers or blocs in order to pursue their national medium-term geopolitical interest exclusively and at any cost. Unilateral initiatives, even military ones, undertaken by many countries in conflict areas such as Syria or Yemen, are a clear example of this. Here I wish to underscore the alarming situation unfolding in Libya, which is geographically very near to Italy. There is a looming threat of an armed solution for the conflict, which would thwart the UN-mediated negotiation. We are equally troubled by the gross and blatant breaches of the UN human rights protection treaties, values, and principles. In this connection, no country can consider itself to be mature. I wish to point out the incident of the European researcher Giulio Regeni, who was tortured, abducted, and killed in Egypt. For the past 3 years now, the Italian Parliament and government, as well as the European Parliament, have been asking Egypt for the truth about the incident, though no investigation ascertaining the liabilities of the parties concerned has been initiated. Notwithstanding, some members of the Egyptian intelligence services are under investigation by Italian prosecutors. All too often, and I'm thinking here of our country and the European Union, we turn a blind eye on human rights and rule of law infringements to safeguard short-term trade or political interests. How do we respond to these attacks against the role and mission of the United Nations? I believe we need institutions with citizens, the media, and in international relations, we must reiterate consistently and forcefully that in the face of new global challenges, no state can harbor the illusion that it can go it alone, and that we need a stronger and more efficient UN. Conflicts over natural resources, climate change, increasing migration flows, terrorism, international crime, growing inequalities between and within countries all require a global alliance to define shared principles and solutions in multilateral fora. We must reject, above all in foreign affairs and trade policies, the illusion that we can better pursue our own interests through privileged bilateral relations with larger and more powerful partners. An important, indeed decisive way to enable this is to enhance the role of supranational organizations, and I'm thinking notably of the European Union. I am convinced that were the Union to speak with one voice in the international arena, including within the UN, multilateralism would gain huge momentum. Furthermore, this would also reinforce the international system for the protection of fundamental rights, which are at the very core of European identity and common values. This is why I have repeatedly advocated, and will reiterate today, the proposal to give the Union a permanent seat in the UN Security Council, in substitution of the seat currently held by some member states. In conclusion, I wish to thank the UN Secretary-General, Mr. Guterres, and reiterate our country's engagement within the UN. Thank you.
Ringrazio.
I wish to thank the President of the Chamber of Deputies for his address, and I am indeed delighted to hand the floor over to the Secretary-General for his address.
Signora Presidente del Senato,
Madam President of the Senate, Mr. President of the Chamber of Deputies, Senators, Deputies, ladies and gentlemen, friends. It's a great honor for me to be here in Palazzo Madama to speak through you to the Italian people during my visit to your country. Italy is a key member of the United Nations. Your country gives an important contribution to the UN peace operations and hosts some of its institutions. We are very grateful to you for your support.
I'll have to go on in English because I really do not speak Italian. Dear members of Parliament, dear friends, as we prepare to bid farewell to 2019, we must take a clear-sighted look at the global situation and the new challenges we face. Our world is undergoing a shift. It is no longer bipolar or unipolar, but it is not yet truly multipolar. Balances of power are changing, creating new and dangerous risks. Around the globe, and just a few hundred kilometers from here, national and regional tensions are spreading. The Sahel, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, these conflicts are causing terrible suffering and uprooting millions of people. Rather than wars between sovereign states, we now see asymmetric conflicts between states and non-state groups. With the growing interference of third partners, these conflicts rapidly take on a regional dimension and are linked to new forms of global instability and terrorism. The impact of the Libyan conflict on the Sahel and the Lake Chad regions show how national conflicts can draw in neighboring states and global powers, creating regional insecurity with implications across continents. It is particularly frustrating to me, and I know how the Libyan conflict is something that is very much in the center of your concerns. It is particularly frustrating to me that the Security Council has declared an arms embargo, has asked for a ceasefire several times. Nobody respects it on the ground, and we have several member states providing weapons every single week to both sides in the conflict, not allowing for what we all want, a ceasefire and a political solution led by the Libyans themselves. In the background of these conflicts is the renewed threat of nuclear proliferation, which is also making a worrying comeback. If we hope to make our world more peaceful and secure, we must start by addressing the underlying causes of tension and conflict. Prevention is more essential than ever, and prevention on the scale we need is only possible through multilateralism. That is why all the work of the United Nations is based on crisis prevention and mediation, combating violent extremism and strengthening peace and security, advancing sustainable inclusive development, and protecting the human rights and dignity of all people everywhere. We are pursuing all these efforts in cooperation with regional organizations, including the European Union and long-standing and essential partners. Dear members of Parliament, dear friends, today I would like to focus on 5 areas in which we face new risks and widening fault lines and suggest some ways of solution. The first area is the failure of global solidarity with the most vulnerable. I arrived in Rome from Geneva, where I attended the Global Refugee Forum. This forum aims to turn the Global Compact on Refugees, agreed by governments last year, into action by sharing responsibility for refugees between members of the international community. I commend the openness, the care and compassion the Italians have shown towards tens of thousands of refugees who have arrived on your shores in recent years. And it is deeply troubling that refugees and migrants continue to die as they cross seas and deserts. We must do everything we can to prevent it by taking action in countries of origin, transit countries, and countries of destination. Above all, we need collective responses, including development programs that target young people with opportunities and jobs in regions of origin. And we must investigate and prosecute the human traffickers and criminal networks that profit from people's misery. And we must strengthen regular pathways for migration and the resettlement of refugees. And honor the integrity of the international refugee protection regime, not just in words, but in deeds. European Mediterranean countries that receive refugees and migrants, like Italy and Greece, are entitled to solidarity and support from their European partners. Unfortunately, until now, we have not seen that solidarity and support fully materialized. Dear members of parliament, dear friends, it is unacceptable that people who fear for their lives are being blamed for society's problems. We must all support each other. We are seeing a troubling pushback against human rights around the world, including rising misogyny, xenophobia, discrimination, racism, and hate speech of all kinds. Populists try to exploit discontent and division to win and keep power. And we must challenge them with leadership and political courage based on reason and facts. That is why I've initiated 2 new strategies at the United Nations to safeguard religious sites and to combat hate speech in all its forms. Diversity is not a threat, but an asset. But it requires investment in social cohesion so that every community feels that its identity is respected and every person can participate fully in society as a whole. Dear members of parliament, dear friends, the second troubling disconnect is between people and planet. The climate crisis is no longer a long-term problem. It is here and it is now. It is a dangerous reality for many people, especially those living in some of the poorest and most vulnerable countries in the world. While they contribute the least to greenhouse gas emissions, they are suffering most. I saw this myself last year when I visited the Caribbean and Mozambique in the aftermath of devastating storms. And I have to say, you, Madam President, have spoken about Venice. My first trip when I got married was to Italy, and was in particular to Venice. And I was so deeply shocked when seeing on television the dramatic impacts on climate change in that wonderful pearl of European civilization. And I want to express my deep solidarity with Venice and with Italy at the present moment. We have fooled ourselves into thinking we can fool nature. But nature is fighting back with a vengeance. The last few years have been the hottest ever recorded. Sea levels are the highest in human history. Ice caps are receding and deserts are expanding. Our ecosystems are facing unprecedented threats. Climate-related natural disasters are becoming more frequent, more deadly, more destructive, with growing human and financial costs. Drought in some parts of the world is progressing at alarming rates, endangering food security, triggering conflicts, and forcing people from their homes. Every year, air pollution associated with climate change kills 7 million people. The climate crisis is a dramatic threat to human health and human security, and this is just the beginning. If we fail to act now, history will record that we had all the tools needed to change, but we choose not to. Our children and grandchildren will not forgive us if we sacrifice their future for fake, short-term profit. The Emperor Nero is still remembered, rightly or wrongly, for fiddling while Rome burned. Do we want to be remembered as the generation that fiddled while our planet burned? I am disappointed, as I said in the aftermath of the meeting, with the results of the climate talks COP25 in Madrid. The international community missed an opportunity to show increased ambition in mitigation, adaptation and finance in order to be able to tackle the climate crisis. But as I also said, we will not give up. It was clear at the talks that most countries are still determined to advance more ambitious climate action and that businesses and financial institutions are moving ahead. The science is clear. We must reduce greenhouse emissions by 45% in relation to 2010 by 2030, achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, and limit the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Even if the Paris commitments are fully respected, they will not be enough to set us on that path. But many countries are not even meeting those commitments. Greenhouse gas emissions are still growing at an alarming rate. We are currently on target to produce nearly 3 times as much coal as is safe for our planet and for our future. But having said so, my message remains one of hope, not of despair. The scientific community tells us that the roadmap to stay below 1.5 degrees is still within reach if we act now. The technologies needed are already available, and the signs of hope are multiplying. More and more cities, financial institutions, businesses, civil society entities are committing to the 1.5-degree pathway. And the most important sign of hope is that young people are mobilizing and taking the lead everywhere, including in Europe. But we need more political will. It is time to put a price on carbon and stop subsidizing fossil fuels with taxpayers' money. We must stop rewarding pollution that is killing people and tax carbon rather than income. The polluters, not the people, must pay. We must stop building coal power plants in the world from 2020 onwards, and stop digging and drilling and take advantage of the vast possibilities offered by renewable energy and nature-based solutions. The world's largest emitters must pull their weight. Without them, our goal is unreachable. And I welcome the EU's recent commitment to become carbon neutral by 2050 and to work on a European Green Deal, including a more ambitious mitigation target for 2030 and funds for a just transition to a green economy. Next year's conference, COP26, hosted by the United Kingdom in partnership with Italy, will be a defining moment. In the 12 months ahead, we must keep climate ambition at the top of the international agenda. We must secure more ambitious national commitments, particularly from the countries with the highest emissions, to start reducing greenhouse emissions immediately, consistent with reaching carbon neutrality by 2050. And we must also meet the expectations of developing countries for resources and support towards adaptation and mitigation, disaster response and recovery. We cannot ignore the social dimensions of the transition to clean energy. National commitments must include a just transition for people whose jobs and livelihoods are affected. We have no time to waste, and we fully trust Italy's leadership in the preparation and the COP26. Dear members of Parliament, the global solidarity gap and the climate crisis are linked with 3 other widening fault lines that should concern us all. First, the risk of an economic, technological and geostrategic fault line dividing the world in 2. The 2 largest economies, the US and China, could create 2 separate and competing areas of influence, each with its own dominant currency, trade and financial rules, and military strategies. Each could have its own internet and its own forms of artificial intelligence. This would dramatically increase the risk of confrontation. We must do everything possible to avert this great fracture and preserve a global system, a universal economy with respect for international law, a multipolar world with solid multilateral institutions. And for this we need a strong Europe as a fundamental pillar of a multilateral order based on the rule of law and respect for fundamental freedoms. This is not always easy, but successful multilateralism depends on a united and ambitious European Union. At the national level, we see another widening fault line in the social contract. People feel that economies are not working for them. We are witnessing a wave of protests across the world. Each situation is unique, but they have 2 features in common: a growing deficit of trust between people and political establishments, coupled with the negative effects of globalization and technological progress. People are suffering and want to be heard. They want equality, social and economic systems that work for everybody. They want their human rights and fundamental freedoms to be respected, and they want to have a say in the decisions that affect their lives. Governments have a duty to listen to their peoples and to respect freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. Everyone must exercise restraint and prioritize dialogue in some of the dramatic crises we are facing today in different parts of the world. Many of these protests are being led by young people, in particular young women. They are making the links between climate injustice, inequalities and insecurity, and calling for new ways of organizing our political, economic and social systems. The response to this deep and widespread discontent should be based on a new social contract that is inclusive and fair for our new age of globalization and hyperconnectivity. All people should be able to live in dignity. Women should have the same prospects of success as men. People with disabilities should have equal opportunities to realize their potential. The sick and the vulnerable should be protected. The 2030 Agenda, adopted by the General Assembly with its 17 Sustainable Development Goals, offers exactly that kind of social contract: sustainable, equitable and inclusive development that works for people and planet. The 2030 Agenda should be at the heart of our thinking on new models for governance. A peaceful and stable society is only possible when there are equal opportunities for all and respect for the rights and freedoms of all. Dear members of Parliament, finally, these inequalities and fault lines are exacerbated by a growing technological divide. New technologies hold enormous promise. They are opening up a new world as tools for peace and sustainable development. But at the same time, they pose risks, and they can be misused for nefarious purposes. The fourth industrial revolution could eradicate entire sectors of the labour market, and while it will also create new opportunities, they might require completely different skills. This could increase divisions and lead to exclusion and inequality. Let us not forget that half of the world is not even connected to the internet. We must therefore put in place long-term education strategies that integrate lifelong learning of new technologies. It is no longer enough to learn. Everyone must learn how to learn, to enable people to train for the jobs of the future, and that no one is left behind. At the same time, within a new generation of social protection, with innovative safety nets for those facing the bigger risks. Technology must be a tool for peace, for social progress and reducing inequalities. And we must also address the misuse of technology to commit crimes, spread hate speech, manipulate information, oppress people, or invade their privacy. We already know the results of these activities. Disinformation campaigns based on lies reach the furthest part of the globe. Many countries have access to sophisticated cyber capabilities that can paralyze entire nations or companies. But what about those countries and people that cannot defend themselves in cyberspace? Traditional rigid regulations, it is true, are no longer possible. Digital technology requires new multi-stakeholder regulation frameworks that are faster and more flexible. And we must also come together to decide on some limits. I believe one of these limits should be a total ban on lethal autonomous weapons with the power and discretion to kill without human intervention. They are politically unacceptable and morally despicable. The United Nations can play the role of a convening platform here. It should be the place where governments, companies, researchers, civil society and others meet to establish protocols, to define red lines and best practices together. Last year, I convened the high-level panel on digital cooperation co-chaired by Melinda Gates and Jack Ma. Its recommendations show how this multi-stakeholder vision can guide our joint efforts to accelerate global internet connectivity, build capacity, and improve digital governance. I'm encouraged that this report has won support from technology companies, governments, and civil society. The European Union has already set an example through the General Data Protection Regulation, inspiring similar measures elsewhere. I urge the EU and its member states to continue to lead, to shape the digital age, and to be at the forefront of technological innovation and regulation. Dear members of parliament, dear friends, I have set out our response to these five-fold lines and gaps based on strong multilateral institutions, solidarity and mutual respect. But multilateralism itself needs to adapt to the challenges of today and tomorrow. Governments alone cannot achieve the 2030 Agenda or the Paris Agreement on climate change. They call for social and economic transformations that will only be brought about with the inclusion and full participation of all those involved, civil society, including young people, the private sector, academia, and more. Women must be at the forefront. We cannot reduce poverty and inequality without addressing the world's most pervasive form of discrimination that affects half of humanity, women and girls. Gender inequality is first and foremost a question of power. And let's be frank, we still live in a male-dominated world with a male-dominated culture. We still shift the balance. We will shift the balance when we truly see women's rights as our common goal. And this is why, immediately after assuming the leadership of the United Nations, I put a strategy in place to achieve gender parity well before 2030. That goal has already been reached in the areas directly under my control. The senior management group and the leaders of our teams around the world have full parity. I will not rest until we have reached gender parity at all levels of the United Nations and full equality for women and girls around the world. Today's multilateralism must be networked and inclusive, closer to the people we serve. We need to work hand in hand with regional organizations, international financial institutions, development banks, and specialized agencies. And our cooperation cannot be limited to intergovernmental approaches and official institutions. I'm happy to see members of civil society and young people here today. Legislators have a crucial role to play. As a former parliamentarian, first of all, I feel very much at home here, but I also know that your contribution is critical in advancing shared progress. Parliaments can be defenders of democracy and agents of accountability, bringing the concerns of ordinary people in the international arena. Today, we need you more than ever as a link between local actions and urgent global priorities. The challenges we face are interlinked and long-term, so must be our response. Fighting the climate crisis means advancing peace and social cohesion. Expanding access to technology means taking action for gender equality. Preventing crises means investing in inclusive and sustainable development. Dear members of Parliament, next year, 2020, we will mark the 75th anniversary of the United Nations by convening a global conversation about the future we want and the UN we need. It will be open to all to gather ideas and encourage collective action. And the results will be presented to world leaders at the 75th session of the General Assembly next September. I invite all to participate in this dialogue. We want to use this anniversary to shape our future. As we look ahead, let's remember that just as all our challenges have been created by humankind, they can be solved by us. We have proven in the past that we are able to come together, that are rise to the occasion, and build a better future for all, and I thank you.
Grazie signor Segretario Generale per il suo prezioso contributo.
I do wish to thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General, for your contribution. And with your visit, you have written a page in the history book of the Italian Parliament. You've covered a number of issues which I am confident will be at the center of careful debate, of focus among the members of Parliament and the youth who have shared in this wonderful experience. And on behalf of the President of the Chamber of Deputies, on my own behalf, I wish to thank you wholeheartedly again. I hope you enjoy your visit in Italy. Perhaps you will have time to visit Venice again. You yourself told us that you've been there before. Hopefully your stay here will be fruitful. And we wish you the very best, and we thank you again.